Hello, dear viewers. Namaskar. Welcome to Moksha Media. You are with Moksha Hiremat. Literature is the reflection of man, matter, milieu, and within and beyond it. But it is not simply a copy of that. It has its own creations, facts, imaginations, and etc. etc. When we look into the literature from these angles, certainly we have some facts. Especially it is seen in the different literary periods. The classification of literary periods is essential in order to know the insights and foresights of it. From this point of view, I would like to say something about Veerashaiva literary period in the history of Kannada literature. Veerashaiva literary period is a unique one in the history of Kannada culture and civilization, Kannada country in particular, and Southeast Asia in general. In Veerashaiva period, we have seen so many specialities, so many novelties. In other periods of Kannada literature, we don't have that much of novelty, we don't have that much of force, we don't have that much of mass participation in literary activities. But in Veerashaiva literary period, we have a novelty, we have a mass participation in literary activities, we have a new force, and we have so many other things. We can know Veerashaiva literary period step by step. Veerashaiva literary period starts from 11th century and extends to the first part of the 16th century. Of course, Jedara Dashimaya and Kondaguli Kesharaja are considered first Veerashaiva literatures. Of course, when we read Vachanas of Jedara Dashimaya, he has grateful to his ancestral Vachanakaras. But most of the Vachanas are not found. That is why, inevitably, we have to start from the Vachanakara Jedara Dashimaya. Anyhow, nowadays, we consider Jedara Dashimaya is the pioneer Vachanakara. And of course, that Kondaguli Kesharaja is the pioneer poet of Veerashaiva literary period. Veerashaiva literary period contributes something to literary novelties. Veerashaivas became wise for voiceless. They followed a new faith. They expressed that new faith in their writings and compositions. Before 12th century Sharanas appear on the scene, we have already Jedara Dasimaya and Kondagudi Keshiraja. And of course, Jedara Dasimaya and Kondagudi Keshiraja acted as university wits who prepared a ground for Shakespeare in the history of English literature. Of course, when we read the Vachanas of Jedara Dasimaya, we come to know the force in it. There are so many Vachanas of him. I cannot quote all those Vachanas due to the time factor. Anyhow, these Vachanakaras and poets gave way to 12th century Sharana's social movement. The Sharana's social movement of 12th century has its own unique qualities. For the first time, the people, skilled, semi-skilled, and others, gathered against the existing social system which exploited the people to a large extent. They opposed it. They gathered the force and they revolted against it in their own way. But that revolt was a non-violent one. It should be kept in mind. It was not violent. It was very, very non-violent. But of course, the upheaval was non-violent, but the suppression of it was very violent. That is the irony of 12th century Sharanas. Sharanas, under the leadership of Basava, led the social movement against caste, gender discrimination, exploitation, and other social evils. Of course, so many persons joined that movement. Allama Prabhu, Channabasavanna, Basavanna, Siddharama, Midivala Machaya, Ambigara Chaudaya, a few names I can quote here. Of course, these persons gathered the people against the social evils and they expressed it in their vachanas. Those vachanas were Shatasthala vachanas. And in those Shatasthala vachanas, they gave voice to the voiceless. They became spokespersons for the faceless persons. They became the friends of the downtrodden. And for that purpose, at that time, many of the downtrodden were accepted Veerashaivism. And these Sharanas offered them Ishtalingas and took them into the fold of Veerashaivism in a mass scale. Of course, that was voluntary one. And as the time goes on and on, most of the Sharanas composed vachanas and poems. Vachana is a form of literature in Kannada. It is a poetic prose. It uses the knowledge part of Vedas and Upanishads, and it has brought the literary activities down to the common people for the first time in the history of Kannada literature. So many common people, so many persons, they might not be literated, but they were literates in the real sense, they were educated in the real sense, and they composed vachanas in the language of Kannada. They expressed their ire over social evils, superstitions, gender discrimination, and professional disharmony, etc., etc. They revolted against the casteism, but they stood for the professional harmony. That is very important, because if we forget that professional harmony, definitely there would be a danger. Whenever we forget that professional harmony in Indian history, definitely there would be a problem. Definitely the caste again comes to the forefront. So, while opposing the casteism, we have to know the importance of that professional harmony. The Sharanas stood for professional harmony. That is why they gathered so many persons into their fold. And this movement continued on and on. Of course, it was ended violently at the end of the 12th century, but the spirit of it is continued even today in different forms. Of course, the Veerashaiva literary period continues even after 12th century, and it passes from 11th century to the 12th century to the 13th century to the 14th century to the 15th century and to the first part of the 16th century. Of course, the force itself was a novel one. The form itself was a novel one. It had its own newness, and for the first time, the people expressed their conditions before others. In the 12th century itself, there were around about 200 Vachanakaras, and 30 women Vachana composers were there out of 200. And Akkamadevi was the model for all of them, for all the others also. For the first time in Indian history, in Indian literary history, such a large number of women writers and composers participated in the literary activities. That is what we have to keep in our mind while saying something about these social upheavals and those social moments in olden days or in the modern days. As the time goes on and on, different forms of different literary forms have been emerged. That Veerashaiva literary period not only witnessed the Vachana form, It also witnessed Ragade. It also witnessed Shatpadi. It also witnessed Tripadi. It also witnessed Ashtakas, Shatakas, and encyclopedias. After the 12th century, after the Vachanakaras, we have the poets like Harihara, Raghavanka, Padmarasa, Somanatha, Puligiri Somanatha, Chamarasa, Nijuna Shivayogi, and Sarvagna. Of course, in Veerashaiva literary period, we have also the poets of other faiths, but their number was very less, but their contribution is very great. Here we have to remember the Jaina poet Janna, who wrote Shodhara Charite and Ajitanatha Purana, and we have to remember Kumaravyasa, who wrote Karnata Bharata Katha Manjari. Of course, it was incompleted. Timmarasa, afterwards Timmarasa, in the later part of the 16th century, completed what Kumaravyasa incompleted. So, in Veerashaiva literary period, other poets of other faiths are also seen, but their number is very less. So, like this, we have seen these trends in Veerashaiva literary period. We can list the characteristics of Veerashaiva literary period. It is a social movement. For the first time, common people composed and involved in literary activities. Women writers and poetesses, composers were also participated not only in the movement but in the literary activities. It contributed a new form, that is Vachana form, to the literature. It also contributed Ragade, Shatpadi, Tripadi, Shataka, Astaka, and encyclopedia. Of course, the language used there is very simple. A common man can understand it when he reads it, when he or she listens to it. Of course, this Veerashaiva literary period not only witnessed vachanas, but great poems and epic, and more than that, an encyclopedia composed by Nijguna Shivayogi. Nijguna Shivayogi was composed that encyclopedia entitled Viveka Chintamani, that is, the jewel of conscious thoughts. For the first time in the history of Kannada literature, we have encyclopedia of that type. Of course, in modern days, encyclopedias are common. We talk of Britannica Encyclopedia, Webster Encyclopedia, etc., etc. But these are the modern development. When the people were not heard, when even literary figures were not heard of encyclopedia, at that time, Nijguna Shivayogi composed encyclopedia, the jewel of conscious thoughts. And he was also a musician. He composed so many kirtanas, and these kirtanas gave way to Purandaradasa, who became the pioneer composer of kirtanas and who became the pioneer in the field of Karnataka music. And of course, the Sarvajna's period may be different, but if we take into fold, he is near to the 16th century, first part of the 16th century. That is why we can include them in this Veerashaiva period also. He was famous for his Tripadis. Even today, those Tripadis are quoted on so many occasions. He is such a popular poet, even common people on the street quote his vachanas. So like this, that the Veerashaiva literary period has its own contribution to the growth and development of Kannada literature and language. Of course, it is a memorable, it is noteworthy in such a great scale or grand scale or large scale. No literary period has contributed to the field of literature. Especially common people participated in it. That is what we have to note it. And another contribution of Veerashaiva literary period was Anubhava Mantapa. This Anubhava Mantapa is an embryo of modern day parliament. Now we have parliament. Of course, that this modern day parliament has been seen in the Anubhava Mantapa itself at the time of 12th century. What Sharanas did and predicted has come true in the later part of the days, in the later days. We are the witness for it nowadays. Of course, now we have so many other evils in addition to the evils they fought against it. But at the time when the developments were not to that extent, at that time those people contributed a lot to the development of Kannada language and literature. If you read Vachanas, Ragale, a literary form, Shatpadi, 6-line poem, Tripadi, 3-line poem, Ashtaka, 8-line poem, and Shataka, 100-line poem, and more than this, the great encyclopedia composed by Nijaguna Shiva Yogi. This enlarges our knowledge phenomena. These make us a human being in the real sense when we read them, when we listen to them. That is why we say the Veerashaiva literary period has contributed a lot compared to other literary period in the history of Kannada language and literature. Even today, the contribution is continued in a different form, but the force behind it may not be like that, but it is in a different form. Of course, that is the growth of, that is the evolving of history. Of course, history is repeated with a different type. It is not a mere repetition, but a repetition with a change and carry forward the spirit of the humanity and etc. Of course, these vachanas go round and round Shatasthala tenets, Shatasthala concepts. That is why we say Shatasthala vachanas. Shatasthala means a six-staged spiritual development. Of course, Vachanakaras chose it for their expression, they chose it for their social activities, they chose it for their social movement, though chose it for upliftment, and of course the concept of Ishtalinga, they have, through the concept of Ishtalinga, they have taken all the ground gardens to their fold. And there is no other things which in which Veerashaiva literary period surpassed all those things. Of course, the mediators are minimized, that is the spiritual mediators. In the name of spirituality, mediators are minimized. And of course, through Ishtalinga, the concept of worship has been universalized for the first time in the history of spirituality, for the first time in the history of religions, for the first time in the history of literature. We have these concepts, and Sharanas, that is the devotees of Shiva, stood for it, and Veerashaiva poets and composers stood for it, and that is the greatness of Veerashaiva, the Veerashaiva literary period in the history of Kannada literature and language. Like, share, and subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Namaskar.